Well, yeah, you try and get them to a place where it's safer, or you can establish yourself as a safe person and talk them down somewhat.
So when does that become? How can you tell if you're like helping the person or if you're being like codependent? Is there a way to differentiate that?
Yes.
The two?
Yes. You're being codependent if you try and do this on a regular basis while they're loaded, because they're not rational.
Okay.
All right? The pros basically will say, look, I need to get you stabilized and you need to see me when you're not loaded. All right? And you get them, so if you're a pro in this situation, you deal with them when they're not, try and stabilize them and get them in a safe place. Go home, sleep it off if you can. But if this is somebody in your personal life, part of the challenge with dealing with that, even if you're a trained pro, is it's a bad boundary violation because you're trying to deal with them while they're loaded, which is not something you do while you're being paid to do it.
Right. A close friend, and she was having an issue, and she's like, can you come help me help?
Yeah.
And so I was like, and her older son was just not working out that situation.
Yeah.
It was frustrating her. And so I'm like, dude, you just gotta like talk to her rationally and just, I left him with her, but it was I don't wanna go into that codependent type,
Yeah, we can't really do that here. But the short, quick answer is you can't deal with them while they're loaded. It's most effective to, after they've come down, slept it off, and basically, gotten a period of time clean, even if that's a day or so.
Right.
And then you say, okay, you can't do that because this is what happens when you do that.
What if that's the only time they contact you? So then they're just loaded.
Yeah, right. It's like, think of it like drunk dialing.
Okay.
Right? It's similar. You talk to somebody rationally while they're drunk dialing, you can't really. But you often have to deal with them because of your relationship, right? Put the boundary up, don't call me when you're loaded. And then they lie, but then you develop a sixth sense about that. Talk to me when you're straight. Click, right. See, that's the difference between being codependent. Codependents don't put up boundaries.
Typically, she doesn't call me when she's loaded.
Okay, that's a start.
So.
That's a start. But she's still reaching out, so. Yeah. So part of the thing, just to finish out the slide because it relates, basically, while you're loaded, you have this preference for non-analytical thinking and perceiving and obsessional focusing. That means you keep focusing on the thing that you don't really need to focus on it. It's not really relevant, but the drug or your thinking pattern has made it more important than it actually is. So, you can only transcend the ego if you experience something larger than it that you can comfortably inhabit. So a person can have a sense or experience of spirituality, for example, without being religious, and a religious person can practice their religion without developing spirituality, too. So religions can, as a means of socialization, they meet the psychosocial needs of human beings for an all-encompassing worldview that tells them who they are, what they can do, and where they're going. And then often, once divorced from their original spiritual roots, a religion can also be used as a means of colonization, social control, as, for example, certain Abrahamic religions, Scientology, etc. I hope they're not going to sue me for this, but guess what? Oh, Jonestown, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Branch Davidians, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
Jesus, that's why I need your wife in an arsenal. Or your wives in an arsenal.
Children.
And your children. Yeah. Yeah, the aliens are coming behind the comet, so let's wear Nikes and kill each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So in any case, the part of the reason where some of those recovery frameworks that I shared last, basically what they often share in common is a particular worldview that might be religiously based or spirituality based. This is why, psychologically, why they work in terms of recovery. So whether it's like a 12-step framework or a CR, Celebrate Recovery framework, there's reasons why these work psychologically. But, he knew there was a but, right? But just to tell you, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The but is this. There's two purposes for education or even a religious or spiritual practice, and that is liberation versus domestication. So poisonous pedagogy, that is not only a way of teaching, but also what you teach about. For example, poisonous pedagogy conveys the message that you trust your inner feelings, intuition, inner processes, and body messages. So, for example, if you think of spirituality and religion as memes, which transmit cultural information and concepts about a person and their relationship to both their inner and outer worlds, spirituality and religion play a powerful role in reinforcing helpful and harmful behavior. So, onset of puberty. So here's what we know in a Western 20th and 21st century framework. Talking about stuff prevents problems. Skill building. Talking about stuff prevents problems. Period. Not talking about it, simple abstinence, causes problems. Denial is not a skill set. Okay? So if I run into a client that essentially grew up in sexual abuse, where incest was normal, and didn't find out that it was abnormal till they got to elementary school, and then stopped it. Okay? The fact that we have that stuff in elementary school against the wishes of the religious community is a good thing. Because the sex talk doesn't happen in Sunday school.
I have a friend that works at the Lowell School District. There was a 7-year-old little girl that'd sit in class and play with herself. She would, and,
right.
And she would suck her cheeks in whenever she'd do it.
Mm-hmm.
And she'd,
mm-hmm.
And the teachers and the staff had to have a meeting. How do we deal with this? And if the other children are, seeing this, if they're understanding, what, and they basically chose to just not, that's the word I'm looking for. They chose not to.
Can I finish? Yeah. So can I finish your sentence based on what you just said? Okay.
Yeah.
So I work dope, right? You know that.
Right.
So where am I going to, given that set of facts that you just presented? Worst case? And if I'm going to go worst case, she's playing with herself and she's mimicking, probably giving oral sex to an adult. Yeah. And she's, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're mandatory reporters. That's why we're mandatory reporters. We would go there first to eliminate the worst case scenario first.
Right.
Okay?
And all the staff just kind of, it blew my mind. All the staff was just, they're at a loss.
Right, they're at a loss because they're scared about the implications.
Exactly.
Right, okay?
And
so in effect,
chose not to.
Right, that is a common response that allows folks like that to slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, that's the thing. Right. I'm in dope. I'm paid to have the courage to speak up about that and go there. Regular practice, right? Many civilians are not, even if they are mandatory reporters. We can address that in training or not, but that's often the reality, right? So part of the and I'm not suggesting, well, maybe I am, but
it just blows my mind.
Well,
nobody would, you know.
Well, that reaction is predictable. It is.
Really?
Yeah, sadly, it's predictable. So part of the piece is, I can agree with religious organizations that should be the province of the parents, but the parents ain't doing it. Because they've been embarrassed because of what they learned in church. Or not learned. Because you don't talk about this unless, I mean, if your primary education is coming from, church, and they ain't talking about it, and this is going on, then this can be a problem. So that's often my biases. So my bias is churches, basically like Glide Memorial in San Francisco, where Reverend Cecil Williams had an outreach to deal with the crack epidemic. So he was dealing with crack addicts in the church service. He was dealing with gang members as part of the Christian church service. Women would talk about their sexual abuse experiences as part of the church service. Okay, but that's San Francisco, not Marcola. Right? But that, again, standard of reference. He's doing that because of the prolific of addiction in a city and, all these other issues. And he said, look, if we're doing healing work, we're doing healing work. If we're bringing the healing words of Jesus, we got to deal with what the people are suffering with. And best believe that is happening in Marco, Pleasant Hill, Veneta, or wherever. It is happening. So how do we deal with it? Or do we? Right? So there is a powerful role in reinforcing helpful and harmful behaviors.
Well, that's kind of weird because that almost contradicts what you stated when you asked the question about the whole Dre Cop thing. And
yeah.
So now I'm confused.
Pastors generally aren't. They don't necessarily mobilize people against
So you're saying express your situation of danger.
You have to assess the actual physical danger of reporting, and do you have evidence that will stand up in a court of law to take them down?
And also,
that's the difference between that situation. Because otherwise I'm just collecting stories, because I hear lots of stories.
Well, without an investigation, you don't know who has been abusive to the child.
If it's been corroborated by other law enforcement officials, which it has, then it's a matter of how do we talk about it? Because there's a code of silence, and they acknowledge there's a code of silence. And they're in a better position to deal with it than I am. And I'm not dealing with them. I'm dealing with the person who's the victim. So I'm more engaged with healing them. Let the cops deal with the cops.
From my own personal experience,
so yeah, it does contradict because it's different.
Yeah.
I shared with a peer who I felt comfortable with that when I was in middle school that, I had been molested. Her mother worked at the school. This girl had been through the same type of trauma. And so I felt comfortable with this girl. Well, this girl shared with her mother who worked at the school, who was a mandatory reporter, and this was reported. And I got the shit kicked out of me by my parents.
Yeah.
I got this shit kicked out of me from my parents for talking about that.
Yeah.
With somebody that I shouldn't have been talking to about. letting them, and these are the things that
You
kids.
didn't know that you couldn't trust them, or they didn't. Well, there are lots of different parameters.
There's tons of different scenarios, but those are consequences that people. Those are real life things to deal with, and you know, kids that would tell me, "Why don't you just run away and go where?
Right.
Be homeless."
Well, you see, lots of kids are homeless for exactly those circumstances.
Those exactly reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, if we shift the mandatory reporting from dirty cops to pedophile priests, we can see what happens if you're in a powerful structure that will protect the perpetrators, and you still won't be able to come. You still are dealt with. I have to heal this person in front of me, and this collection of mandatory reporters is protecting its bad actors for its own PR purposes. I still have to do that. I mean, I have to deal with that as a fact as well, even if I collect the same standard of evidence. So these are the contradictions that we live with.
Rocks and hard spots.
Right. So become like water.
You need a community to heal many problems.
What you're trying to say, and I get everyone is trying to say, and I know things have happened in stories, but I think you have to be careful, very, very careful to generalize.
Yep.
You know,
I am.
church or religion.
Right.
And
right.
Because things happen with different races, different genders, different religions, different governments or something, but you can't stereotype or generalize, and I think that's a really thin line that is easily crossed.
Yeah. So religions disseminate the meme that certain behaviors, morals, ethics, values are good and other behavior is bad. This is similar to the views in certain religions every other religion is less valid, i.e. inferior, or that only certain sects of a religion practice the true faith. Whether not trying to practice cultural relativism here, I'm just saying the memes are successful or not. And so part of the deal in terms of looking at the client is what they believe and what would be an optimal practice. So in the interest of health promotion, spirituality and religion mediate the effects of stress and, when non-addictive, enhance an inner locus of control, which correlates with self-efficacy, resiliency, and other qualities that promote health. That's on the good side. So it can provide a framework for health, but it can also provide a toxic framework too. Both. You have to be able to assess correctly what's going on. All right? So consider the interests of health. Some forms of religion and spirituality reinforce addictive and toxic memes, especially those that, for example, alienate a person from being comfortable in their own body, or having skill with identifying, controlling, directing their own thoughts, emotions, and so a felt connection to the body is blocked by trauma or poisonous pedagogy. Also, there's a certain stage of recovery in which the nervous system, as it's detoxifying itself, becomes more sensitive. Right? So people can associate that with relapsing behavior, like a drug experience, which is not the drug necessarily. It could be parts of your body waking up that have been numbed. Now they're not numbed, and you're actually experiencing sensation there, and, oh, am I loaded? Am I, what is this experience? So that can also be useful for promoting certain types of mind-body discipline practices that are not within your native religion, if your native religion does not, or spirituality practice does not give you a framework for dealing with those things, especially within recovery.
I think that's true too. Like I was in an auto accident and I have a bunch of stuff going on in my back and I have restless leg syndrome now. And there's days when I just, like I'm having a hard time sitting today. And there's days that it doesn't bother me. So that's kind of interesting with that.
So cheap substitutions, drugs or process addictions with emotional triggers form biochemical blocks on body wisdom. So I'm suggesting that your body does in fact have a wisdom coded in it from DNA that often ges blocked by both toxic pedagogy and also drug or process behavior. So let's get into midterm review.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
How many of your clients would you say come in with like a strong religious view or something that has been toxic to them?
Many of them. Even if they come in with a strong religious framework, a lot of them have felt burned. Well, I mean, if you came from a strong fundamentalist background and you're an alcoholic, okay? So there's a difference between how alcoholics are looked in this society because alcohol is a legal or illegal drug versus any other drug. If they get strung out on heroin or pot or some other, or meth, then there's a certain amount of shame that is imparted upon them because it's one of the bad drugs. They get strung out on pharmaceuticals. There's less of a stigma with that than with street drugs, even though pharmaceutical use can lead to street drugs when your prescription runs out. So they come bearing that baggage. So it depends on the religious framework. And so a lot of times, people don't want to get involved with 12-step because of the quasi-religious flavor of that. Because it reminds them of church and reminds them of judgments, negative judgments that they've had with church. So you deal with that. Say, look, at least it's a non-drug using community that's theoretically non-judgmental as long as it is non-judgmental. But then depends on the that you get. Which is why, a lot of people like me because, the quote-unquote normie thing and my reliance on neuroscience. And I said, well, you still have to develop a relationship to who you are, whatever you are. You don't have to believe what I believe, but understand what you believe and why that works for you or not, because it might be limited. If it's a Christian framework, if it's a fundamentalist Christian framework. So Yeshua came from a culture that does not practice celibacy. Does not practice celibacy. So how come we have no idea about Jesus' sex life? Do they just forget to write that down? So then what is about sexuality? So if we think about the big book as being taken directly from Christology, and the only mention of sex in the big book of AA is literally on page 69 and 70, and it essentially says don't hurt anybody, and if you feel the imperious urge, throw yourself into service work to, suppress the sexual urge. That's very nice sentiment for 1939, but we ain't Catholic priests. And then we have that thing within the program about the 13th step. You talking out of both sides of your neck. Going out and recruiting people of the opposite sex at a meeting or whatever. In case you don't know about the 13th step. Ha ha.
What do you have to do?
It's not a requirement. It's an internal program joke. So part of the mythology within 12-step framework is if you're not in a relationship, don't start a relationship for a year, right? Like people do that. Wait, again, celibacy? There's some sound cycle principles about it, like don't start a rebound relationship. That makes sense. But when do you start a relationship? How do you consciously end a relationship? What if your partner's using all these different parameters? You don't necessarily get formal training on that because there's no formal training in the religion that it came from. That's part of the piece, right? So that's why I did this piece on, okay, your religion can help you, hinder you, particularly on what it talks about.
I don't think churches talk about the anatomical aspects of sex.
They do not.
It's the moral
Right.
that they talk about.
Right.
Which is okay because, you learn the anatomical in school, and yeah, someone's got to have the sex talk with you and everything, but I don't think it's a religious obligation to teach.
Well, that depends on the framework. In some religions,
Yeah, and
I think that
Like
everything that has to do with the social group of any kind that is from childhood through adult or however long you're there, supposedly, I think they have an obligation of some kind. I don't know what that is particularly.
Yeah,
This-
an obligation of the moral.
Yeah, there.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's anatomical also, because it doesn't have to be brought and broke down, in my opinion, to the form of explicit picturing, but I think it needs to be brought in the form of, you're gonna go through this, you're gonna have these emotions. And
Right.
when you go through this, you know, we're here for you if you want somebody to talk to. And or we have people set up that are your age group or, you know, a little older.
Yeah.
They can help them with that because they just shut them off.
So if I
Yeah.
can, we have 10 minutes and I have to get through this, right? So a moral structure basically gives you the why to do, the why or why not to do, but not what to do, okay? What's lacking is the what to do, right? Somebody has to teach that. That's consonant with the framework. Somebody has to do that because silence isn't working, clearly. So, neurotransmitter is chemicals used specifically by nerves to talk to other nerve cells or other cells within the body. Purpose of an addiction, to obscure positive or negative internal process. Addictions are two broad categories: process addictions and ingestive addictions. 5 cultural views of addiction: sin, disease, maladaptive behavior, life out of balance, koyaanisqatsi, slavery, and weapon. When addiction is a maladaptive behavior, it's a learned behavior. Educate the addict. So, the one that's not a major concept in the disease model is that the addict is irresponsibly, willfully misbehaving. That's the concept of its sin. Genetic predispositions only proven with one substance, alcohol. What you hear in genetic predisposition, higher tolerance for alcohol. Drug is a substance that changes the function of living tissue. Which of the following that are not process addictions, the eating disorders are not process addictions. They're ingestive. Polyaddiction and cross-addiction, many types of addiction, and the fact that addictions may overlap. So not one of the 3 factors in addiction, which is corporate responsibility. So this one was only 2 or 3 people got this one. So here's what is the concept that I'm trying to get across here. Lethal dose for 50% of whatever you tested it on basically changes with body weight. Takes less to kill a 14-year-old. Okay, lower blood alcohol. All right, so here's how that works. Middle school girl, 0.21. She's 100 pounds. That was 4 doses to produce that for her.
That was the lethal dose or half the lethal dose?
She coded, went to Sacred Heart on 3 beers and a shot of vodka.
Oh my God.
Whoa.
Okay? So, 100 pounds.
You know, was she shotgunning them?
Yeah. Right. They did shoulder tap and, brought it back to the South Hills, and this was, Spencer Butte. Not that it matters, but again. Okay? Good neighborhood, stable family, blah-de-blah-de-blah, right? College student, 0.35. That's hazing ritual, basically. And then naive adult, 0.45 to 0.50. So naive means without drug tolerance. No family history, which, how many people do we know like that, really, these days? Anyway, they exist.
I think I assumed that then that the college student would have more.
I did too.
Yeah, right.
Tolerance than the naive adult.
I know, but basically saying, okay, people have normalized various behaviors. We've been losing college students at a point. It's been a frequent enough news item that...
He also said that it depends on the weight.
It does. It also
Weight
depends
of
on the
25.
tolerance.
So, like, if I take a shot of alcohol, it works for 2 hours. If I take 2 shots, it can work for a lot longer.
Well, these are people that are taking 10 or 12.
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know what my numbers are.
Well, there, you can figure it from the chart that you have. All right, halfway through. Of the following, the only substances without addictive potential are water and oxygen. I'm not sure about the oxygen because there are oxygen bars, but hey, whatever. Endorphin are to heroin as norepinephrine is to amphetamine or dopamine cocaine. Marijuana contains THC and anandamide is the neurotransmitter THC represents. Nicotine resembles acetylcholine. 3 types of process addictions. I accepted any one that you did. Environmental model in public health is depicted as equilateral triangle with 3 labeled vertices: host, agent, and environment. The environmental model: strengthen the hosts, change the environment, interdict or neutralize the agent. 3 types of tolerance: metabolic, behavioral, tissue. Okay, metabolic is how fast you break down the substance. Behavioral is being able to function in the presence of the substance. Tissue is when the body becomes addicted and requires the substance to function normally, and the usual marker for tissue tolerance is withdrawal in the absence of the substance. This does not happen with all drugs, LSD being the most notable exception. Side effect, marketing term to describe a normal effect of a drug, which is not the primary marketed effect of the drug. Neurochemically, is an addictive behavior because of endorphins, etc. Most of you seem to get that if you answered it. The difference between pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and pharmaceutics. Pharmacology is the study of drugs. Pharmacokinetics, how drugs move and are changed throughout the body, how they're metabolized, how they're excreted, sites of action, etc. And pharmaceutics is making drugs able to enter through either pills, lotions, suppositories, or aerosols, based on the chemistry of the drug and the chemistry of the specific sites in the body. Describe what cravings are from the point of view of the organ called the brain, basically persistent, intrusive thoughts around the substance or using. Neuropeptide Y basically reduces activity and increases food desire. Why are menthol cigarettes more addicting? Menthol suppresses the cough reflex, and minorities are the main target market, but this basically gives you the idea that certain populations are segmented for specific things. Marlboro used to be a woman's cigarette. 3 types of family structures: extended, nuclear, or single parent. D. Examples of addictive organizations. Now, not 12-step organizations. I mean the problem. I know some of you consider 12-step organizations the problem, but no. Addictive organizations that are the problem, not addictive organizations that address addiction.
Like military religion?
Yeah, right. Very few people got that wrong if they answered it. Articulants between abuse and dependence and DSM. Abuse is use despite negative consequences in 3 life areas. Dependence, the above, plus tolerance and withdrawal. Coercive control model. Most people got that, if you got that already at all. If I were chronically depressed, what drugs am I most likely to self-medicate with? Stimulants. Rage and trauma, medical cocaine, opiates, and alcohol. Give me 30 seconds. Thanks. Boredom is only one way the brain recovers. Word puzzles, meditation, activity. 8 common stress responses to racism from Clark's research. You got that. It's been a pleasure. And this begins the Lanyap THC Quit Kit, how to walk people through quitting marijuana over a period of time. A few other things, another 50 slides, tolerance. Anyway, here's the midterm. Midterm will be up on Moodle in 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention. Go forth and heal the world.
So we